Hey everyone, and welcome to The Year Was, the podcast all about today that gives you just enough information to effectively be that guy at the party, causing all your friends to question, hey, who invited you? Like, seriously, why are you here? I'm your host, Michael Montalvo. For the next few minutes, we will open history's door and find out what makes today truly unique. On this episode, we examine the events that occurred December 24th. In 1968, NASA had still yet to land on the moon. In 1968, there was turmoil and war and protests and riots, and due to assassination, the world lost both Martin Luther King Jr., who we have featured on the show before, and Robert Kennedy, who was running for the presidency. The nation was shook. In a year where things seemed to go wrong, no, not 2016, where people fought and lost loved ones, NASA was in a race to the moon against the Soviet Union, much like Rocky was against Drago, or like how Creed was against Drago. And that's when we got some bad news. The Russians had made it to the moon. On September 18th, 1968, the Zond 5 circled the moon and returned safely to Earth. If we were to keep John Kennedy's promise of reaching the moon by the decade's end a reality, then NASA needed to kick it into gear. But after the disaster that was Apollo 1, safety was a much bigger priority than it already was, and so it needed to be done as fast and as safe as possible. In a last-minute decision, Apollo 8 would become the second manned mission of the Apollo program, and its 6-day mission would begin on December 21st. The three-man crew, which consisted of Commander Frank Borman, Command Module Pilot James A. Lovell Jr., both who we recently talked about on the Gemini 7 episode, and Lunar Module Pilot William Anders, would make their way to the moon and place the stepping stones for the eventual journey that would be Apollo 11. Because Russia had already made it to the moon, NASA decided to forego its initial plan to test the lunar and command module components in the safety of Earth's orbit, and instead decided on venturing out and making the lunar orbit. In a bit of interesting trivia, the night before the launch, Charles Lindbergh, the first man to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean, visited the Apollo 8 crew, and after being told that the rocket would consume 20 tons of fuel a second, replied, "In the first second of your flight tomorrow, you'll burn 10 times more fuel than I did, all the way to Paris." The launch went smoothly, with the then untested Saturn V rockets performing their job without issue. Borman would later say, after the vehicle was released, the noise in the cockpit got very loud. After only 12 minutes, Apollo 8 was above the Earth, where they orbited only twice before the rocket's third stage ignited, and the three men were rocketed away like some sort of rocket man. So the launch went without issues, but the same could not be said of the trip in space. 18 hours into the mission, Frank Borman became ill, and a private message was radioed explaining the situation. NASA would perform a private consultation, and upon hearing that his health was improving, cautiously gave the go-ahead to continue with their mission from the Earth to the moon. I had to throw that phrase in there. Approaching the moon, they knew they still had some work to do, as getting into lunar orbit would still be a difficult task. The engine needed to fire on the dark side of the moon, so they would need to be like wizards in their magical land far away from home in order to get into the right spot. Because of its position, this meant that the astronauts would astronaut be in communication with the Earth, and if an error occurred, it would mean that the orbit would not be possible, and the three men would head home having failed to perform their mission objective. The year was 1968, and on this day, Christmas Eve, Apollo 8 entered lunar orbit. The crew made 10 orbits over the course of 24 hours. Borman called the landscape a vast, lonely, forbidding type of existence, with Lovell adding it was a grand ovation to the vastness of space. On the fourth orbit, the crew rolled the spacecraft in order to position itself to take panoramic photos of the surface, in part to determine potential landing sites, and that's when Anders noticed something on the horizon. "Oh my God, look at that picture over there. Here's the Earth coming up. Wow, is that pretty?" In what would become arguably one of the most famous photos, Anders snapped a shot of the Earth and the Moon. Spoiler alert, the photo Earthrise would later be published December 30th, 1968. Lovell would later reflect that they were looking at something that had been hidden from man for millions of years until we went around the other side to look at it. On Christmas Eve, 1968, Apollo gave what would be the most watched television broadcast up to that point. In it, they showed the surface of the moon, describing it as a dark and unappetizing place. They actually see and mention the Sea of Tranquility, the future landing site of Apollo 11. Also on this broadcast, they ended with a reading of the first 10 verses of the book of Genesis, each in turn starting with Anders, then going to Lovell, and finally Borman. They started their message, "We are now approaching lunar sunrise, and for all the people on Earth, the crew of Apollo 8 has a message we would like to send to you. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters, and God said, 'Let there be light,' and there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good, and God divided the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night, and the evening and the morning were the first day. And God said, 'Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters.' And God made the firmament, and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. And it was so. And God called the firmament heaven, and the evening and the morning were the second day. And God said, 'Let the waters under the heavens be gathered together unto one place, and let the dry land appear.' And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters called the seas. And God saw that it was good." And from the crew of Apollo 8, we close with good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good Earth. The crew would stay in orbit for 20 hours before firing the service module engine for 3 minutes. Had the engines failed, they would be stuck orbiting the moon with no way to return. But re-emerging, Lovell called out, "Please be informed, there is a Santa Claus." And Apollo 8 made its way safely back to Earth, where it had a successful splashdown December 27th, 1968. And that's going to do it for us today. If you like this podcast and want to hear more, give us a rate and a review. That helps me out and helps steer this in a direction that is hopefully good for everyone. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can find the audio version on your podcast app of choice. Links in the description. You can find me on social media and at YouTube at the Ample Cider Club. And as always, I want to thank the Tim Kreitz Band for our musical theme, and to thank you for listening. We'll see you next time.